Usually when we talk about a country's wealth, there's this expectation of a really direct, undeniable correlation.
Right, like a 1-to-1 ratio.
Exactly. It's almost like, looking at a medical X-ray. You scan the Earth, the geological X-ray shows massive deposits of natural resources, and the diagnosis is just simple, right? Unprecedented wealth, prosperity, economic stability.
Yeah, it's treated as a completely binary outcome, like you have the resource, therefore your citizens thrive. That is, well, that's the standard assumption anyway.
Right. It feels clean. We like things to make sense on a ledger. I mean, if you have a massive vault of gold under your house, you shouldn't be struggling to buy groceries.
You really shouldn't, no.
But when you apply that logic to the actual landscape of global energy geopolitics over the last century, that X-ray machine is completely broken.
Well, totally shattered.
The diagnostic landscape is just murky, contradictory, and honestly, it's pretty dark.
Which is exactly why we are unpacking this specific investigation today. We're looking at a deeply researched historical document. It's titled Oil War: The Complete Story of Black Gold.
Yeah.
And the mission here for this deep dive is to figure out why exactly that X-ray machine is broken. We're looking at the really intense hidden intersection of energy, global economics, and military power.
Right, because this isn't just about, fuel for cars.
No, not at all. It's about how the world's most essential commodity has been, well, engineered into the ultimate weapon of geopolitical control.
Now, just a quick but really crucial heads up for you as we get into this. The investigation we're looking at today makes some pretty heavy politically charged claims.
Yeah, it really does not hold back.
It doesn't. It implicates multiple U.S. administrations across several decades. It scrutinizes international leaders, and it challenges the underlying motives for a lot of global military interventions.
Right.
So we are not here to take a side, and we aren't, endorsing the moral judgments that might be implied in the text. Our job is just to impartially lay out the historical timeline, the data, and the specific connections exactly as this investigation presents them.
Exactly. So you can build your own understanding of the argument. We're just pulling apart the mechanics of it. We really want to look at the why behind the what.
So let's jump straight to that broken X-ray machine, because the central paradox this investigation uses to hook you is just brilliant.
It really is.
If I asked you right now to name the country with the largest proven oil reserves in the world, what's your immediate guess? I mean, most people, without missing a beat, would say Saudi Arabia, or maybe like Iraq.
Sure. It's the logical assumption based on the news cycle of, the last 50 years.
But it's Venezuela.
Right.
The data points out they have a staggering 302 billion barrels. They are #1 globally, comfortably beating out Saudi Arabia.
Which is wild.
It is. Yet look at the reality on the ground in Venezuela today. Hyperinflation, severe food shortages, a collapsed healthcare system where, basic medicines are just unavailable.
Yeah, and a tragic exodus of over 7 million people fleeing the country.
Exactly. The nation sitting on the absolute largest ocean of black gold on the planet is suffering from systemic mass poverty.
And that paradox, it just repeats itself. Like, look at Iran.
Oh, yeah.
They have the 4th largest oil reserves in the world, 157 billion barrels. And if you add to that their massive natural gas reserves, a highly educated population, a vital strategic location bridging the Middle East and Asia, I mean, they have every single ingredient required to be an absolute economic juggernaut on the global stage.
But instead, they are incredibly economically isolated.
Completely.
Crippling sanctions, a currency that has basically collapsed in value, inflation rates frequently soaring over 40%. And the investigation argues this isolation isn't just a byproduct of diplomatic disagreements.
No, they argue it's directly tied to a specific choice. Like, Iran opted to stop selling its oil exclusively in U.S. dollars while simultaneously pursuing a nuclear program.
Which introduces a much broader, incredibly systemic pattern. I mean, look at the timeline of the last 25 years. Afghanistan in 2001, Iraq in 2003, Libya in 2011, Syria in 2015.
Right.
What do these incredibly different nations actually share? They've all faced direct or indirect military action, regime change, or just heavy intervention from the United States.
And the common thread linking them, according to this investigation anyway, isn't just a generic fight against terror or, a push for democracy. It claims the thread is oil, or more specifically, attempts by these sovereign nations to break away from the U.S. dollar system.
The statistics presented here are honestly staggering. Fact number one from the source. From 1945 to 2023, the United States has engaged in over 80 military interventions globally.
80.
Over 80. And when you map those interventions out, the vast majority occur precisely in oil-rich regions or along strategic maritime oil shipping lanes.
Which is just, I mean, you have to ask yourself, is that just a massive geographical coincidence?
Right.
The narrative of this document makes it very, very clear that it absolutely is not. The entire thesis we are exploring today is that a highly secretive, highly engineered financial system created in the 1970s has dictated global conflicts for the last 50 years.
Right. To understand the modern world, like why certain nations are punished, why certain alliances with nations like Saudi Arabia are maintained despite massive ideological differences, you have to understand how this financial architecture was built from the ground up.
Exactly. You can't understand the chess game if you don't know who carved the board.
Well said.
So to do that, we have to rewind. Long before oil was the pillar of a covert financial empire, it was just, well, a strange viscous liquid bubbling up through the dirt.
Right, so we need to go back to August 27th, 1859. The location is Titusville, Pennsylvania.
Enter Edwin Drake.
Yes, Edwin Drake, a guy who hilariously was just a retired railroad conductor.
Right.
People called him Colonel, just to give him some unearned credibility, even though he had absolutely zero military background.
It's a fantastic historical quirk. But what Drake accomplished fundamentally changed the trajectory of human civilization. He applied salt well drilling techniques to search for petroleum.
Okay.
He essentially built a steam-powered drill and dug 21 meters deep into the Pennsylvania soil.
Wait, 21 meters? Let's just visualize that for a second. That is roughly the height of a 6-story building.
Yeah, it's really not that deep.
Well, we aren't talking about a journey to the center of the earth here. You could yell down that hole and someone would hear you.
But it was enough. I mean, he struck oil. And this moment in 1859 is widely considered the birth of the commercial oil industry. Drake's first well started producing 25 barrels a day.
Let's just hold that number in our heads for a second to really grasp the scale of the technological explosion that followed. 25 barrels a day in 1859.
Okay.
Fast forward to today, and Saudi Aramco alone produces roughly 10 million barrels a day, every single day.
It's incomprehensible.
We are looking at a 400,000-fold increase in production over 165 years.
Drake unleashed a monster, honestly. But he didn't actually understand the true nature of what he'd found.
Right, he was just thinking small scale.
Exactly. He thought he just discovered a resource to sell locally, like a replacement for whale oil to light lamps. The true realization of what oil represented didn't come from the men digging the holes.
Oh.
It came from a man who realized how to monopolize the entire ecosystem around those holes.
Right. The first true king of oil, John D. Rockefeller. He steps onto the scene in 1870 when he forms the Standard Oil Company.
And Rockefeller looked at the wildcatting days of early Pennsylvania oil, which was chaotic, boom and bust, wildly unpredictable, and he just saw incredible inefficiency.
Yeah.
His genius was recognizing that the power wasn't in the risky business of finding the oil in the ground.
Yep.
The real power was in the bottleneck.
The bottleneck, right.
If you control the refining, the pipelines, the transport, you control the entire industry.
He didn't care who pulled it out of the ground because eventually they all had to bring it to him to make it usable. He was ruthlessly efficient at vertical integration.
Absolute ruthless.
Over the next 2 decades, he systematically bought out, starved out, or just crushed his competitors. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled 90% of all oil refining in America.
90%.
That is a level of market dominance that makes today's tech monopolies look like, I don't know, corner lemonade stands.
It really was the first true global energy empire. And Standard Oil became so powerful, so deeply entrenched in the political and economic fabric of the country, that the U.S. government realized it had a sovereign threat on its hands.
Yeah, they had to act.
Under the Sherman Antitrust Act, they dragged Rockefeller to court and forced the company to break apart in 1911.
Okay, let's unpack the mechanics of this, because this is where the history takes a deeply counterintuitive turn.
It really does.
The government forces Standard Oil to break up into 34 separate pieces to kill the monopoly. The whole goal is to punish Rockefeller and dilute his power.
Right, cut him down to size.
But the source data shows that immediately after this breakup, the value of Rockefeller's shares absolutely skyrocketed. Adjusted for inflation, his personal net worth ballooned to over $400 billion.
It's insane.
To put that in perspective, that makes Modern titans like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk look entirely middle class. How on earth does breaking a monopoly make the monopolist richer?
It's a brilliant paradox, and it comes down to the mechanics of corporate valuation and vertical integration. Prior to the breakup, Rockefeller essentially held a massive, somewhat unwieldy, globally sprawling conglomerate.
Okay.
The stock market had a really hard time accurately valuing this absolute behemoth because its operations were so opaque and just deeply intertwined.
So it's like taking a massive slow-moving cruise ship and breaking it down into a fleet of 34 speedboats.
Yes, exactly.
The speedboats can navigate the booming market much faster, they are easier to value, and crucially, Rockefeller still held the deed to every single speedboat.
That is the perfect mechanical analogy. When the government forced it to splinter into 34 regional companies, entities that would eventually become the giants we know today, like Exxon, Chevron, and Mobil, those individual pieces were suddenly unleashed.
Right.
They no longer had the sluggish bureaucracy of a single massive monopoly, but they still absolutely dominated their respective regional markets.
They were lean, they were aggressive, and the market could suddenly see their individual profit margins.
Exactly. And because the internal combustion engine was just taking off, the Industrial Revolution was kicking into high gear, and demand for refined oil products was surging.
The timing was perfect.
The aggregate valuation of those 34 highly nimble regional monopolies far exceeded the valuation of the sluggish parent company. The breakup didn't destroy his wealth. It unlocked its true market value.
So the government tries to bring him to heel and accidentally mince the richest man in modern human history. It's wild.
It really is.
But while the corporate drama was playing out in America, the center of gravity for global oil was about to shift dramatically. The investigation moves us away from Pennsylvania and across the world to the Middle East.
Right. The year is 1908. A British entity, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which eventually evolves into British Petroleum, or BP, strikes commercial oil in Persia, which is modern-day Iran.
And this is the exact moment oil stops being just a lucrative business venture and transforms into a matter of existential state security.
Completely.
The document brings in a quote from Winston Churchill, who was serving as the first Lord of the Admiralty in 1914. He went before the British Parliament and delivered a stark warning. He said, "We must be the owners, or at any rate, the controllers at the source of at least a proportion of the oil which we require."
And to understand why Churchill said that, you have to look at the military technology of the time. The British Navy was the undisputed ruler of the seas, and their fleet was entirely powered by Welsh coal. But coal is heavy. It requires massive manpower to shovel, and it produces huge plumes of black smoke that reveal a ship's position from miles away.
And oil changes all of that.
Completely. Oil has a higher energy density, meaning ships could travel faster and further. It could be pumped through pipes, drastically reducing the manpower needed in the boiler rooms.
Right. No more guys shoveling coal.
Exactly. And it burns cleaner, allowing for stealthier maneuvers. Churchill knew that transitioning the fleet to oil was the absolute only way to maintain naval supremacy.
But there was a massive strategic vulnerability. Britain had abundant coal, but they had absolutely zero domestic oil.
Precisely. Churchill recognized that national survival now depended entirely on controlling foreign oil fields.
Wow.
The British government couldn't just rely on the free market. They immediately secured a 51% controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. The military-industrial complex and the oil industry were now officially, permanently married.
So if 1908 was the spark in the Middle East, 1938 was the detonation. This is when an American company, Aramco, the Arabian American Oil Company, discovers oil in Saudi Arabia.
And this wasn't just a successful drill site. The geologists who mapped this out were staring at something almost incomprehensible.
Yeah.
Just beneath the surface of the Saudi desert lay the Ghawar oil field. To this day, it remains the largest conventional oil field ever discovered on the planet.
The scale is just hard to fathom. The investigation points out that this single field has been pumping oil for over 65 years, relentlessly fueling global economies, and it is still producing massive daily yields.
Which brings us to how this massive shift in geographic resources dictated the outcome of the biggest conflict in human history.
Right, World War II.
The investigation presents a deeply compelling mechanistic argument that beneath the surface-level ideological battles, fascism versus democracy, the Allies versus the Axis World War II was, at its very core, an oil war.
We're usually taught about the military strategies, the blitzkriegs, the political maneuverings. But framing the entire war through the lens of fuel logistics completely shifts the perspective.
It really does.
Let's look at Germany. They had an incredibly advanced, highly mechanized military, but they had a fatal geographic flaw: virtually no domestic oil reserves.
They had access to some minor fields in Romania, and they invested heavily in trying to manufacture synthetic oil from coal, which was an incredibly expensive and inefficient process.
Right.
But it simply wasn't enough to sustain a multi-front, mechanized global war.
So how does that dictate their strategy?
Look at Hitler's disastrous decision to break the non-aggression pact with Stalin and invade the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa.
Okay.
It wasn't just ideological hatred, it was a desperately pragmatic necessity. The German war machine was literally running on fumes. The primary goal of the southern push into Russia was to capture the massive oil fields of the Caucasus, specifically around Baku in modern-day Azerbaijan.
And that leads directly to the Battle of Stalingrad, arguably the bloodiest and most pivotal battle of the war.
Exactly. Stalingrad sat on the Volga River, which was the primary transit route for that Caucasus oil heading north to fuel the Soviet army. Germany needed to cut that lifeline and secure the oil for themselves.
But they couldn't.
No. When the German Sixth Army was encircled and defeated at Stalingrad, they lost their chance at the Baku oil. From that moment on, the German tanks, planes, and supply trucks were systematically starved of fuel. You cannot execute a blitzkrieg if the tanks can't turn their engines on.
Right. And it wasn't just the European theater. The logistics of oil dictated the Pacific War just as heavily. The investigation argues that Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was fundamentally a reaction to American economic pressure regarding oil.
Japan was an expanding imperial power with grand ambitions in Asia, but like Germany, they lacked domestic natural resources. Before 1941, Japan imported roughly 80% of its oil from the United States.
80%. That is massive leverage.
And the U.S. used it. In response to Japanese aggression in China and Indochina, the U.S. imposed a total oil embargo.
Wow.
Japan's military reserves were instantly put on a ticking clock. They calculated they had perhaps 1 or 2 years of fuel left before their entire Navy and Air Force would be paralyzed.
So they had a choice: abandon their imperial ambitions and withdraw, or find a new source of oil.
They chose the latter. The closest abundant source of oil was the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. But to take that territory, they knew the U.S. Pacific Fleet stationed in Hawaii would intervene.
Therefore, they had to cripple the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor first, simply to clear the shipping lanes to grab the oil they needed to survive.
Precisely. The attack on Pearl Harbor, stripped of its ideological rhetoric, was a preemptive strike born of an oil blockade. The winner of World War II was ultimately going to be the side that could keep its engines running.
And the United States and its allies won. They had the domestic reserves, they had the logistical supply lines, and they emerged as the undisputed global superpower. But as the investigation notes, post-WWII, the U.S. recognized a stark reality. To maintain that superpower status permanently, they needed an architecture to control global oil markets. They needed a presence in the Middle East, and they needed to cement a permanent alliance with Saudi Arabia.
Which sets the stage perfectly for what is arguably the most consequential, highly classified financial arrangement of the 20th century.
Okay, this brings us to the core mechanism of the investigation: the Nixon shock and the secret petrodollar deal.
Yes.
To understand why the U.S. did what they did in the 1970s, we first have to understand the economic system they built right as World War II was ending, when they held all the cards.
We have to travel back to 1944. The war isn't quite over, but the writing is on the wall. 44 allied nations send their leading economists and finance ministers to a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire.
Okay.
Their goal was to design a brand new global economic order out of the ashes of a destroyed Europe and Asia.
And the United States was in a uniquely dominant position. Their industrial base was completely untouched by bombs, and they held the vast majority of the world's physical gold reserves, as European nations had been shipping their gold to the U.S. to pay for weapons and supplies.
Because of that dominance, the delegates agreed to a new system that essentially crowned the U.S. dollar as the undisputed king. The agreement pegged the U.S. dollar directly to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce.
So 1 ounce of gold is exactly $35.
Yes. And here's the crucial second step. Every other currency in the world, the franc, the pound, the mark, was then pegged to the U.S. dollar.
So the dollar becomes a proxy for gold?
Exactly. It was literally as good as gold.
Yeah.
This meant that central banks around the world could hold their national wealth reserves in U.S. dollars, trusting completely that at any moment they could knock on the door of the U.S. Treasury and exchange those paper dollars for physical gold bars.
That's huge.
It gave the United States immense, unprecedented financial dominance and stability. But a system like that, where paper represents physical metal, requires extreme fiscal discipline.
Because you can't print more paper than you have metal in the vault.
Exactly. And discipline is exactly what the United States government lost in the 1960s.
The era of guns and butter.
Precisely. You had President Lyndon B. Johnson pushing massive domestic spending programs known as the Great Society, while simultaneously escalating a hugely expensive war in Vietnam.
Right.
The U.S. government was bleeding cash, and to pay for it all, they simply started running the printing presses, flooding the global market with U.S. dollars.
But the amount of physical gold sitting in Fort Knox wasn't increasing.
Not at all. And the international community isn't stupid. They started doing the math.
They figured it out.
The investigation highlights French President Charles de Gaulle as the loudest voice calling out this discrepancy. De Gaulle became deeply suspicious of the sheer volume of dollars circulating globally versus the actual gold the U.S. held.
He essentially looks at the U.S. and says, "You're writing checks that your vault can't cash."
So de Gaulle calls their bluff. He demands that France's massive U.S. dollar reserves be converted back into physical gold, and he actually sends the French Navy across the Atlantic to physically retrieve the bullion.
That is an incredible flex.
It really is.
And it sparks a panic in Washington because the U.S. realizes the terrifying truth. If every country demands their gold right now, the U.S. will default. They literally do not have enough gold to cover all the paper they've printed.
This impending crisis forces the hand of President Richard Nixon. On the evening of Sunday, August 15, 1971, Nixon goes on national television and delivers what becomes known historically as the Nixon shock.
He closes the gold window.
He unilaterally, without consulting the international community, severs the link entirely. In a 15-minute speech, the Bretton Woods system is dead. The U.S. dollar is no longer backed by gold.
So what does that actually mean? Mechanistically, the dollar is now backed by...
By nothing tangible. It becomes a fiat currency. Fiat is Latin for let it be done, or by decree.
Okay.
Mechanistically, it means the dollar only has value because the U.S. government says it has value, and because they demand you use it to pay your U.S. taxes. It's backed purely by the faith, credit, and, frankly, the military might of the United States.
Wait, I really want to challenge this logic, because it feels like a massive cliff the global economy just walked off.
It was.
If the dollar is officially backed by nothing tangible, how did it possibly remain the world's reserve currency? Why didn't France, Germany, Japan, and everyone else just abandon it the very next morning? I mean, if I give you an IOU for a car, and then one day I announce I actually don't own a car, but you should still trade me your goods for my pieces of paper, you'd laugh in my face. You wouldn't accept my paper anymore.
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question.
Yeah.
And the geopolitical reality is that for a brief window, the U.S. dollar was incredibly vulnerable. Its value began to plunge.
It makes sense.
The U.S. government knew that to keep the dollar as the world reserve currency and to prevent hyperinflation from destroying your economy, they needed to tie the paper to something new, something that every single country in the world desperately, non-negotiably needed.
Not a shiny metal sitting in a vault, but something practical, something that powers the modern world.
Oil.
But the U.S. didn't own all the oil. So how do you force the world to use your paper to buy someone else's resource?
This is where the narrative shifts to 1973, which was a year of massive, terrifying crisis for the United States and the catalyst for a permanent solution.
Right. The investigation sets the scene with the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Egypt and Syria launch a surprise attack on Israel. The United States quickly steps in to provide massive financial and military airlift support to Israel. This infuriates the Arab nations within OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries.
And because they couldn't fight the U.S. military directly, they decided to retaliate using the only weapon they had, which turned out to be far more devastating, the global oil supply.
They declare an oil embargo against the United States and its allies, and the macroeconomic impact was devastating and immediate. We aren't just talking about expensive gas, we are talking about a systemic shock. In just 6 months, the price of a barrel of oil skyrocketed from $3 to $12, a fourfold jump almost overnight.
You have to picture the day-to-day reality in America during this time. The investigation paints a very vivid picture. You had miles-long lines of cars idling at gas stations, hoping the pumps wouldn't run dry before they got to the front.
Yeah, people waiting for hours.
The government instituted emergency rationing. They created an odd-even license plate system. If your license plate ended in an odd number, you could only buy gas on odd days of the month.
Highway streetlights were literally turned off to save municipal energy. Commercial flights were grounded. The mighty United States, the undisputed victor of WWII, was utterly paralyzed by a group of Arab oil-producing nations.
It was a brutal wake-up call for Washington. They realized their extreme vulnerability. They had a fiat currency backed by nothing, facing plummeting global demand, and an entire economy completely dependent on an energy resource controlled by foreign powers who were currently hostile to them.
A perfect storm.
They needed a permanent structural solution to solve both the currency crisis and the energy vulnerability at exactly the same time.
Enter Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. The investigation details that in 1974, Kissinger undertakes a highly secretive, high-stakes diplomatic mission to Saudi Arabia.
Why Saudi Arabia? Because, as we discussed earlier with the Ghawar field, Saudi Arabia was the swing producer.
Right.
They had so much spare capacity that they could unilaterally dictate global oil prices by simply opening or closing their valves. If you make a deal with the Saudis, you effectively control OPEC.
Kissinger sits down with the Saudi royal family, and he negotiates what the document calls the Petrodollar deal. And the terms of this deal are the linchpin of the entire thesis we're exploring.
The mechanics of the deal are fascinatingly asymmetrical. On the American side, the U.S. agrees to provide an absolute security umbrella.
Okay.
They promise military protection to Saudi Arabia, access to highly advanced American weaponry, intelligence sharing, and unconditional political support for the Saudi royal family on the global stage, regardless of their domestic policies or human rights record.
Basically, the U.S. military becomes the private security force for the House of Saud. And in exchange for this ultimate protection, Saudi Arabia makes three massive concessions.
Number one, Saudi Arabia agrees to price and sell its oil only in U.S. dollars. No other currency will be accepted. Whether you are Japan, France, or Brazil, if you want Saudi oil, you must pay in U.S. dollars.
Number two, Saudi Arabia agrees to take their massive newly acquired oil revenues, these new petrodollars, and invest them directly back into U.S. Treasury bonds.
Let's pause and unpack the mechanics of this second point because it's vital. A Treasury bond is essentially a piece of paper saying you lent the U.S. government money and they will pay you back with a little bit of interest. By forcing the Saudis to buy Treasury bonds, the U.S. was effectively recycling the dollars they spend on oil back into their own economy.
It's a closed-loop system. We buy your oil, you take our cash, and you immediately loan it back to our government to fund our deficits.
Exactly. It creates an artificial, massive global demand for U.S. debt. When foreign nations buy U.S. debt, it suppresses U.S. interest rates. This means the U.S. government can borrow money incredibly cheaply to fund its military and social programs.
And the third concession.
Saudi Arabia agrees to use its massive leverage as the swing producer to convince the rest of the OPEC members to adopt this exact same dollar-only pricing policy.
And this agreement, which officially birthed the petrodollar system, was kept highly classified.
For a very long time.
The investigation notes it was a secret for over 40 years, with the exact details only coming to light through declassified documents around 2016. But its macroeconomic effects were immediate, profound, and permanently changed the world.
Let's really drill down into the mechanics of why this is so powerful. Think about a country like South Korea. South Korea produces incredibly advanced electronics, cars, and ships, but they have very little domestic oil. To keep their factories running, they must import oil.
But because of the petrodollar deal, OPEC will only accept U.S. dollars. South Korea cannot pay in their own currency, the won.
Correct. Step 1. South Korea needs oil. Step 2. Oil is priced exclusively in dollars. Step 3. To get those dollars, South Korea must export its real goods, Samsung TVs, Hyundai cars to the United States, or they must sell their own currency on foreign exchange markets to buy dollars, which devalues their own money.
This is the exact moment where the light bulb goes off. The United States literally prints pieces of paper with green ink, and the rest of the world is forced to trade them real physical goods, real human labor, real services, and real energy just to acquire that paper so they don't freeze in the winter.
Exactly.
The demand for the U.S. dollar is artificially, permanently kept high globally because it is the toll booth you have to pass through to buy the energy required for human survival.
This is the genius of the system. It allows the United States to run massive, multi-trillion-dollar trade deficits without suffering the hyperinflation that would completely destroy any other economy attempting the same thing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
If Argentina or Turkey just printed money to buy imports, their currency would become worthless in weeks. The U.S. does it, and the world absorbs the inflation.
The French economist actually coined a perfect term for this, which the investigation highlights: exorbitant privilege.
It is the ultimate economic cheat code.
Hmm.
The document quotes Barry Eichengreen, a Nobel laureate in economics, who actually calculated the hard value of this privilege.
Oh, wow.
He estimated that having the dollar installed as the mandated world reserve currency gives the United States a free economic benefit of roughly $100 billion to $150 billion every single year.
I really want you to grasp how this affects you directly. If this system didn't exist, if the U.S. couldn't export its inflation globally through the petrodollar, the cost of living in America would be unrecognizable.
It would be a completely different reality.
Your mortgage rates would be double digits. A carton of eggs might cost $30. The standard of living in the United States is directly subsidized by this global demand for dollars.
It is a staggering structural economic advantage. But as the investigation makes very clear, the countries actually sitting on the oil, the producers, weren't going to stay blind to this dynamic forever.
Right.
They eventually realized they were part of a system that heavily exploited their natural wealth, which leads us to the next massive phase of this history. The cartel strikes back, focusing on OPEC and the brutal reality of price wars.
To understand why the producers rebelled, we have to look at the incredibly lopsided contracts that existed before the petrodollar deal back in the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah.
The investigation describes a cartel of Western oil companies, historically referred to as the Seven Sisters. These are the ancestors of modern giants like Exxon, Chevron, BP, and Shell. They essentially held monopolistic control over the Middle Eastern oil fields.
And the sovereign host nations were getting an abysmal deal. The historical data points out that in 1950, Saudi Arabia was receiving a meager 20% of the revenue generated from the sales of its own oil.
That's just wild.
The other 80% was flowing directly back into the pockets of these Western corporate giants and their shareholders in New York and London.
It's modern colonialism through corporate contracts. You have sovereign nations watching their singular, finite natural resource being drained from beneath their feet, while the vast majority of the wealth leaves their borders.
It was an entirely unsustainable imbalance of power, which brings us to a historic turning point. September 14th, 1960. The location is Baghdad, Iraq.
The investigation details a pivotal meeting of 5 major producing nations: Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. They look at the math, they look at the Seven Sisters, and they decide they've had enough.
Yeah, they hit their breaking point.
They formally band together to form OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries.
Their officially stated mission was diplomatic, to coordinate petroleum policies and ensure a fair return on capital for the producing countries. But if you strip away the bureaucratic language, the real message was a declaration of war against the Western monopolies. They were saying, we are taking control of our own resource back.
And as we just discussed with the 1973 embargo, that newly organized power eventually flexed its muscles with devastating effect.
It sure did.
They proved they could bring the global economy, and specifically the mighty United States, to a grinding halt by simply turning the spigot down 5% a month.
And while that 1973 embargo was the catalyst that terrified the U.S. into creating the petrodollar deal, installing that dollar system didn't end the tension. It just evolved the conflict from direct embargoes into highly complex, multi-billion-dollar economic warfare.
Which the investigation brilliantly brings into the modern era. Let's fast forward to the years between 2014 and 2016. The United States experiences a massive disruptive technological breakthrough, the shale oil revolution.
This is a crucial mechanical shift in the global balance of power. For decades, U.S. domestic oil production had been steadily declining. But then, engineers perfect a combination of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, commonly known as fracking.
Mechanically, what are they doing?
Instead of just drilling straight down into a massive pool of oils, they drill down, then turn the drill horizontally through dense layers of shale rock. They then pump millions of gallons of water, sand, and chemicals at ultra-high pressure into the rock, shattering it and releasing the oil trapped in the microscopic pores.
It's an incredibly aggressive, technologically complex way to get oil. But it works. Almost overnight, the United States reverses its decline and rockets to becoming the #1 oil producer in the world.
And this terrified the leadership in Saudi Arabia.
I bet.
For 40 years, the U.S. was their biggest customer and their military protector. Suddenly, the U.S. is a massive, independent competitor. American shale companies were flooding the market and eating directly into Saudi Arabia's global market share.
So how does Saudi Arabia retaliate against this new American independence? They can't declare war. So the investigation explains they launched a brutal, highly targeted price war. And they did it in a completely counterintuitive way. Instead of cutting production to keep prices high and maximize their profits, Saudi Arabia did the exact opposite. They opened the floodgates.
The underlying logic here is ruthless, but economically sound. It comes down to the break-even cost of extraction. In Saudi Arabia, the oil is under pressure close to the surface. You stick a pipe in the ground, and it practically flows out on its own. It costs them maybe $3 to $5 to extract a barrel of oil.
But American shale extraction is a complex, expensive industrial process.
Exactly. At that time, American fracking companies needed the global price of oil to stay around $40 to $50 a barrel just to break even and pay off the massive debt they took on to build their rigs.
So the Saudis deliberately crashed the price. The investigation notes they flooded the global market with cheap crude, and the price of oil plummeted from over $100 a barrel all the way down to $30 a barrel.
The explicit, calculated goal was to starve the American shale companies of revenue, making it impossible for them to service their debt and force them into mass bankruptcy.
And looking at the data, the outcome was an absolute bloodbath for the U.S. industry. Between 2015 and 2016, over 200 U.S. oil companies filed for bankruptcy. We are talking about massive defaults in places like Texas and North Dakota.
That was huge.
Over 100,000 highly paid jobs in the oil sector vanished almost overnight.
It was a massive calculated blow. But the U.S. industry, driven by free market survival instincts, didn't completely die. The investigation points out that the surviving American companies were forced to aggressively innovate.
They had to.
They improved their drilling tech, they drastically cut their operational overhead, and they managed to lower their break-even costs to weather the storm.
Meanwhile, the math caught up with the Saudis. The investigation notes that Saudi Arabia burned through over $250 billion of their own sovereign financial reserves trying to win a price war they ultimately couldn't finish.
It was a wildly costly miscalculation by the kingdom, but the document makes a point to highlight just how much latent financial power they still wield. Even after absorbing that massive $250 billion loss, look at the statistics for Saudi Aramco in recent years. In 2022, their net profit was $161 billion.
Let's contextualize that number.
In that same year, Apple's net profit was $99 billion. Google's was roughly $59 billion. A single state-owned oil monopoly generated more pure profit than the two most powerful technology giants on Earth combined.
That level of wealth is almost structural. It's practically a force of nature. But as the investigation transitions into the next phase of its argument, we learn that this immense wealth and the petrodollar system that continuously feeds it isn't just maintained through market forces, technological innovation, or even aggressive price wars.
Right.
It is ultimately enforced with raw military might. The document asks us to examine the deadly geopolitical cost of defying the U.S. dollar, and it starts with a deeply uncomfortable look at Iraq.
This is where the investigation stops looking at economic theory and connects the petrodollar directly to geopolitical violence and regime change. The text presents Iraq as the primary, highly visible case study of what exactly happens to a sovereign nation that attempts to unilaterally opt out of this mandated financial system.
And it sets the stage by pointing out a massive, often forgotten historical contradiction regarding Saddam Hussein.
Yeah.
For most people listening today, the cultural memory of Saddam Hussein is purely as the cruel dictator the U.S. overthrew in 2003, the man synonymous with weapons of mass destruction and the axis of evil. But the document insists we look back at the geopolitical alignment of the 1980s.
During the 1980s, the map looked very different. Iran had just gone through its 1979 Islamic Revolution, overthrown the U.S.-backed Shah, and become fiercely anti-American.
Okay.
So when Saddam Hussein's Iraq launched a massive military invasion into Iran in 1980, sparking a brutal, grinding 8-year war, the United States didn't view Saddam as an enemy. They viewed him as a highly useful proxy.
The investigation is very explicit about the level of support provided. It wasn't just diplomatic nods. The data shows the U.S. actively provided Iraq with advanced satellite intelligence, billions in agricultural credits to keep their economy afloat, and direct military weaponry.
And the investigation brings up a much darker claim. It details how the U.S. and its Western allies provided the precursor chemicals and technology that allowed Saddam to develop his chemical weapons arsenal.
Which he absolutely used. The text specifically highlights the horrific 1988 Halabja massacre, where Saddam's forces dropped chemical nerve agents on a Kurdish town, killing over 5,000 civilians in a single day.
And the document points out that the U.S. government was fully aware of these atrocities, yet actively worked to protect Iraq at the United Nations, repeatedly blocking resolutions of condemnation.
Wow.
Why? Because at that moment in history, a strong, ruthless Saddam Hussein was viewed as a necessary bulwark against the spread of Iranian influence.
He was their guy. Until he wasn't. We hit 1990, and Saddam makes a massive miscalculation. He invades neighboring Kuwait. Kuwait is not only a staunch U.S. ally, but crucially, it shares a massive border with Saudi Arabia.
The investigation suggests that Washington realized Saddam was no longer a controllable proxy. He was now a direct, unpredictable threat to the regional stability of the Arabian Peninsula, the very stability that the entire petrodollar system relied upon.
So the U.S. instantly flips the script. President George H.W. Bush launches Operation Desert Storm, the Gulf War, and the U.S. military absolutely decimates the Iraqi army, pushing them out of Kuwait in a matter of weeks.
But the crucial detail the document highlights is what the U.S. didn't do in 1991. They didn't march to Baghdad. They didn't remove Saddam from power.
Why not? If he was such a threat, why leave him on the throne?
Because of the geopolitical chessboard. The U.S. strategists calculated that completely destroying Saddam's regime would create a massive power vacuum and chaos in Iraq, which Iran would immediately exploit to expand its power. The U.S. preferred a weakened, heavily sanctioned, contained Saddam Hussein over a chaotic region that could threaten the steady flow of global oil.
But then the investigation points to a specific, pivotal moment. A fatal mistake Saddam made that completely changed the calculus in Washington. The year is 2000.
According to the timeline in the document, in the year 2000, Saddam Hussein stands up and makes a highly public, intensely defiant announcement to the world. He declares that Iraq will no longer accept U.S. dollars for its oil exports. From that day forward, Iraqi oil would only be sold for euros.
Now, I want to jump in here and play devil's advocate, because on the surface, this just sounds like an administrator accounting preference. Why would the United States care enough to go to war over which piece of paper Iraq puts in its cash register?
You have to look at the macroeconomic threat this posed. The euro was a brand new currency at the time, launched in 1999. It was looking to establish itself as a legitimate global reserve currency to rival the dollar.
Ah, I see.
If Saddam Hussein successfully proved that a major top-tier OPEC nation could completely bypass the U.S. dollar, trade its oil in a competing currency, and survive, it would break the psychological monopoly of the petrodollar.
It sets a terrifying precedent for Washington.
Exactly. If Iraq does it successfully today, what stops Iran from doing it tomorrow? What stops Venezuela? What if the unthinkable happens and Saudi Arabia decides to diversify into euros?
A whole system collapses.
If the OPEC nations stop demanding dollars, the global demand for the dollar collapses. The U.S. loses its exorbitant privilege, interest rates skyrocket, and the American economy faces an existential inflationary crisis.
And Saddam didn't just threaten to do it. He executed the plan. The investigation notes that Saddam set up an account at the French bank BNP Paribas, and between 2000 and 2003, Iraq successfully sold over 3 billion barrels of oil, generating $26 billion in revenue, all entirely denominated in euros.
The document draws a bold, direct, chronological line between this successful currency switch and the rapid, intense escalation of U.S. war planning against Iraq that immediately followed.
Now, obviously, the official public narrative presented to the world for the 2003 invasion was vastly different. It wasn't about currency.
Right. The public justification was entirely built around the imminent threat of weapons of mass destruction.
So the investigation is heavily implying that the entire WMD narrative was an engineered smokescreen to hide the true motive crushing a rebellion against the petrodollar. Let's look at how the document dismantles the official story.
It takes us to February 2003, highlighting Secretary of State Colin Powell's highly publicized presentation at the UN Security Council. He presented what he claimed was ironclad satellite and intercepted audio evidence of mobile biological weapons labs, active nuclear programs, and deep operational links between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda.
But the investigation aggressively refutes every pillar of that presentation. It points out that within a year of the invasion, the U.S. government's own investigative body, the Iraq Survey Group, published a comprehensive report confirming unequivocally that there were no WMDs. There were no active biological or nuclear programs.
Furthermore, the text breaks down the geopolitical absurdity of the terror link. Saddam Hussein ran a secular, nationalist, Ba'athist dictatorship. Al-Qaeda was a radical religious extremist organization whose stated goal was to overthrow secular Arab leaders like Saddam.
So they were enemies.
Ideologically, they were mortal enemies. The idea that they were collaborating never made analytical sense.
Yet, despite the lack of evidence, the shock and awe invasion happened. And the document lists the staggering, horrific human and economic costs of this action.
It was devastating.
It cites over $2 trillion charged directly to American taxpayers. 4,500 American soldiers lost their lives, and conservative estimates place the civilian death toll in Iraq at over 200,000 innocent people.
It's an utter tragedy. And to drive its core thesis home, the investigation points out two incredibly telling, highly specific details about the immediate aftermath of the invasion.
The first detail is about the fall of Baghdad in April 2003. As the city fell, it descended into absolute chaos. Massive looting, museums being ransacked, hospitals stripped of equipment, a total collapse of civil security infrastructure.
Right.
Yet, amidst all that burning chaos, what was the one single building the U.S. military heavily barricaded and protected with absolute priority?
The Iraqi oil ministry. The text notes that while the cultural and civil institutions of the country were allowed to burn, the oil ministry and its geological maps were kept in perfect, secure condition.
And the second detail is even more blatant. Almost immediately after the U.S. established the Coalition Provisional Authority to run the country, Iraqi oil sales were quietly but swiftly switched back to being priced exclusively in the U.S. dollar. The euro accounts were closed. The rebellion was instantly terminated.
The investigation caps off this entire section with a devastating quote from Alan Greenspan. Greenspan was the chairman of the Federal Reserve, literally the architect and guardian of the American monetary system.
Yeah.
In his 2007 autobiography, he wrote, "I am saddened that it's politically inconvenient to acknowledge what everyone knows. The Iraq War is largely about oil."
When the guy running the U.S. Central Bank puts that in writing, it lends incredible heavy weight to the document's claims.
It does. And if Iraq was the warning shot to the world, the document presents our next case study as the brutal confirmation of the rule. This brings us to the story of Libya and the terrifying threat of the African gold dinar.
So the narrative moves from the Middle East to North Africa, where another sovereign leader attempted a massive structural break from the dollar's monopoly. We are looking at Muammar Gaddafi.
And right out the gate, the investigation asks the reader to look past the standard Western media portrayal. For decades, Western news painted Gaddafi purely as an eccentric, violently unpredictable dictator who sponsored terrorism, which he undeniably did in cases like Lockerbie.
But the document demands we also examine his actual domestic economic record within Libya. And the statistics provided here completely challenge the narrative of a ruined nation.
Looking at the data under Gaddafi's rule, Libya consistently held the highest Human Development Index, the HDI, on the entire African continent.
Let's explain what the HDI actually measures, because it's an important metric used by the UN. It doesn't just measure GDP, it measures life expectancy, access to education, and the overall standard of living for the average citizen.
Exactly. And the document lists the realities of life in Libya at the time. Free universal health care, free state-funded education through the university level, near zero unemployment due to state jobs, heavily subsidized electricity, and even policies like a $50,000 government grant given to every newlywed couple to help them buy their first home and start a family.
The macroeconomic transformation of the country was undeniable. The text points out that when Gaddafi took power in a bloodless coup in 1969, the per capita income in Libya was roughly $60 a year. It was one of the poorest nations on earth. By the time of his death in 2011, per capita income had risen to $14,000. That is a 233-fold increase in wealth over 42 years.
He also utilized oil revenues to fund massive, ambitious infrastructure, most notably the Great Man-Made River Project.
Oh, that was huge.
This was an incredible engineering feat that pumped fresh water from ancient aquifers deep beneath the Sahara Desert and piped it hundreds of miles to the coastal cities, literally turning the desert green.
Now, to maintain our objective lens, the text does clearly acknowledge the dark side of his rule. He was a strict authoritarian, he ruthlessly suppressed political opposition, there was no free press, and there were serious documented human rights violations against dissidents. He was not a benevolent saint.
But the crucial point the investigation makes is that, unlike many dictators who simply hoard their nation's wealth in Swiss bank accounts, Gaddafi was actively reinvesting a massive portion of Libya's oil wealth back into his people and his infrastructure.
Right.
This domestic success made him a highly influential, deeply respected figure across many other African nations who were struggling with post-colonial poverty.
He was a visionary for Pan-Africanism, and that immense regional influence is exactly what made his next move so incredibly dangerous to the established global financial order. Between 2009 and 2011, the document reveals that Gaddafi proposed a revolutionary economic plan, the creation of the African gold dinar.
This is the explosive core of the Libya section. Gaddafi didn't just want to switch his oil sales to the euro like Saddam did. He realized the euro was just another fiat currency printed by Western powers. He wanted to create an entirely new, independent, pan-African currency that was fundamentally backed by physical gold.
The ultimate hard money.
Yes. And his proposal wasn't just for Libya. He wanted to unite the continent. He proposed that all 54 African nations establish a unified central bank, adopt the gold dinar, and officially stop selling their natural resources, their oil, their diamonds, their platinum, their cobalt, in US dollars or French francs.
Wow.
He wanted them to demand payment only in this new gold currency.
Let's break down the mechanics of the geopolitical earthquake this would cause, because it is massive. Africa holds the largest concentration of untapped natural resource wealth on the planet. If that entire continent suddenly stops accepting US dollars for its resources, what happens?
The demand for the US dollar plummets globally. It would be a catastrophic blow to the petrodollar system. The exorbitant privilege of the United States, their ability to print paper in exchange for real global wealth, would be severely threatened and perhaps completely broken.
And Gaddafi wasn't just giving speeches, he was executing the logistics. The text states that Libya had quietly, over years, stockpiled 143 tons of physical gold specifically to underwrite this new currency.
He was serious about this.
He was actively presenting this highly detailed plan at African Union meetings. The investigation notes that while some African leaders were terrified of Western retaliation, others were highly interested. He was building real momentum.
Which brings us to the tragic timeline of his downfall. The document moves to early 2011, the height of the Arab Spring. Protests break out in Benghazi against Gaddafi's rule, quickly evolving into an armed rebellion.
And almost immediately, NATO intervenes, backed by a hastily pushed UN Security Council resolution. The official public reason broadcast to the world was civilian protection and the international responsibility to protect civilians from potential government retaliation.
But the investigation demands we look at the hidden motives, focusing specifically on the aggressive roles played by France and the United States. The military operation, notably, was heavily pushed and initially spearheaded by French President Nicolas Sarkozy.
And here's where the text introduces a massive, deeply corrupt scandal. It cites leaked documents and subsequent legal investigations alleging that Sarkozy had actually taken over $50 million in illegal, clandestine campaign funding directly from Gaddafi to finance his successful 2007 presidential election run.
The source argues that Sarkozy had two massive hidden incentives to spearhead the bombing of Libya. First, to permanently destroy the evidence and the witness of this highly illegal campaign funding.
That makes sense.
And second, to stop the gold dinar plan, which posed a direct existential threat to French economic interests in West Africa, where France still heavily controlled the monetary system through the CFA franc.
Furthermore, the document points to hard evidence from the American side. It references the highly publicized leaked emails belonging to then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton.
These emails are the smoking gun of the investigation. The text claims that intelligence memos sent to Clinton explicitly cited Gaddafi's massive gold reserves, the 143 tons, and overtly analyzed his plan to create the gold dinar as a direct, unacceptable threat to dollar dominance.
The intervention, according to the data presented, wasn't a noble crusade for human rights. It was a desperate, violent maneuver to protect a currency monopoly.
And the text recounts the grim, gruesome end for Gaddafi. On October 20, 2011, his convoy is bombed by NATO jets. He is captured by rebel forces, found hiding in a drainage pipe, and is brutally tortured and killed by a mob.
And the source notes a chilling, highly controversial reaction from Hillary Clinton, who, upon hearing the news during a television interview, laughed and stated, "We came, we saw, he died."
A reaction that the document contrasts sharply and tragically with the reality of what happened to the Libyan people immediately after. Post-2011, the state of Libya completely collapsed. The nation that previously held the highest HDI in Africa descended into a brutal, fragmented, ongoing civil war.
The infrastructure was destroyed. The economy completely collapsed, massive poverty took hold, and horrifyingly, investigative journalists documented open-air slave markets operating in the ruins of the country. A humanitarian intervention that resulted in a generational humanitarian catastrophe.
And the investigation leaves us with one final, deeply cynical, lingering mystery regarding the fall of Libya. What happened to the wealth?
Right. Gaddafi's entire threat to the dollar was based on tangible, physical assets. But after the NATO intervention and his assassination, the document notes that Libya's central bank was essentially looted.
Those 143 tons of physical gold that were supposed to liberate the African continent. Officially missing. Vanished without a trace.
The text also cites a UN report noting that a massive, significant portion of Libya's sovereign wealth fund, which is essentially a giant state-owned investment portfolio built from oil profits, valued at roughly $67 billion, is simply unaccounted for. Billions of dollars in global assets and tons of physical gold simply vanished into thin air in the chaotic fog of, quote, liberation.
It's a dark, incredibly sobering, almost dystopian end to the first half of this investigation. The document paints a picture of a global financial system that is not just a passive market reality, but a highly engineered machine that is fiercely and violently protective of its own mechanisms.
Okay, we have covered a massive, heavy amount of ground today. We started by looking at Edwin Drake's 21-meter hole in the Pennsylvania dirt and traced how Rockefeller's Standard Oil taught the world the true power of monopolizing a bottleneck.
We explored the brutal logistics of World War II, seeing how the desperate need for fuel dictated the movements of armies and proved that oil was the ultimate military asset.
From there, we broke down the macroeconomics. We looked at the hubris of the Bretton Woods gold standard, the panic that led to the Nixon shock, and how Henry Kissinger engineered the secret 1974 petrodollar deal with Saudi Arabia, a masterstroke that saved the U.S. currency and established the exorbitant privilege that subsidizes American life to this day.
We saw the producing nations realize they were being exploited, leading to the formation of OPEC, the crippling reality of the 1973 embargo, and the modern, technologically driven shale oil price wars.
And finally, we walked through the deeply unsettling, tragic case studies of Iraq and Libya. We looked at the data suggesting that two sovereign nations, whose leaders dared to publicly attempt to price their immense natural resources in something other than the US dollar, were utterly and systematically destroyed for it.
It is a heavy, mechanically complex narrative, and the thing is, this is only part one of the investigation.
Next time, we're moving fully into the modern era. We'll explore the case studies the investigation provides on exactly why Venezuela, the country with the most oil on Earth, is currently collapsing. We'll look at the real, mechanistic reasons behind Iran's crushing economic sanctions.
We will also analyze the modern fracturing state of the U.S.-Saudi alliance and look at how rising massive superpowers like China and India are aggressively maneuvering to challenge this high-stakes game. You really will not want to miss it. There's a lot more to unpack about where this fragile system is heading next.
But before you jump into part 2, I want you to mull over a thought experiment. Think back to that X-ray metaphor we started with. If a nation is incredibly wealthy in natural resources, if the geological scan shows billions of barrels of oil under their soil, but that nation is forced by